It's great to see everyone tonight as we go through the book of Joel. We're trying to go through the entire Bible, and now we're in the minor prophets, Hosea last week and Joel this week. And tonight we have with us Shay and Mike. So we're excited to just kind of do a quick overview, about 30 minutes of the book of Joel. So we'll have Shay start with the first question, and we'll go from there.
Yes, sir. Who wrote the book of Joel, and when was it written? And to whom did Joel prophesy?
Okay, so who wrote the book of Joel?
I'm
That would be Joel.
Joel, yeah. You know, that's a good answer, Mike. And whether you know it or not, if you have one of these books that has kind of a name of a person, you know, the first thought would be, yeah, but Joel is typically given credit for that. When was it? That's kind of honestly, we don't know when the book of Joel was written. They kind of date it. There's actually not much in the book of Joel that would give you a date. It's dated kind of like where it falls. Hosea, Amos, that time early in the divided monarchy. Now you'll get some argument on this. I looked at that the other day again on this date. But most people would kind of put it, you know, mid 800s to very early 700s, and so it's even though he's probably prophesying to Judah, he is definitely before the fall of the northern kingdom in 722. So it's a relatively early prophet, very early prophet, I would add. So to whom does Joel prophesy?
Judah.
To Judah.
Yes. And you know, that's you know, Israel, Judah, and so yeah, he does. Yeah, there we go. Judah, primarily the southern kingdom and stuff. Even though he's prophesying before the northern kingdom falls. Remember, that's 722, and then of course 605 to 586 is when the southern kingdom will actually first taken captivity. 605. But anyway, so. Read the second question, if you would, and then after she reads that question, if you would, Mike, will you read chapter 1, verses 1 through 4? Okay.
Question 2, according to Joel, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, what shocking events have just taken place?
Okay. Will you read that passage, Mike?
Okay, chapter 1, verse 1. The word of the Lord came to Joel, the son of Pethuel. Hear this, O elders, and listen, all inhabitants of the land. Has anything like this happened in your days or in your father's days? Tell your sons about it, and let your sons tell their sons and their sons the next generation. What the gnawing locusts have left, the swarming locusts have eaten. What the swarming locusts have left, the creeping locusts have eaten. And what the creeping locusts have left, the stripping locusts have eaten.
Okay. In these 4 verses, and in particular verse 4, it talked about the locusts and what they devoured. It identifies either 4 different types of locusts, or some people say 4 stages in the development of a locust. But you know, so what has just taken place? What is transpiring here? Do you think that he would write this? What shocking events do you think may have taken place?
Just from the Assyrians.
Well, we're going to pick that up with the third question, and that third question will be, what do the locusts refer to? But the locusts, go ahead.
This, I think, is twofold. I believe it was an actual event of devastation by the plague of the locusts. But again, it points forward to the Assyrians later on as an overwhelming, because they talk about locusts as being an army almost,
Yes.
moving across the land.
And again, in the third question, well, I'll tell you what. Let's just combine the second and third question, because they kind of go together. So read the second question, and we'll come back and talk about this point.
Okay, on the third question,
There
Joel
you
chapter 1, verse 4, and chapter 2, verse 25. How many times does the word locust occur in the book of Joel? Are these locusts the literal insects, or are they symbolic of something else?
Okay. So let's answer that first question first, and go back to the deeper question. How many times? So Mike just read 1 through 4, but read verse 4 again, and then turn over and read 2:25. And let's count the number of times the word locust occurs here.
Okay. Verse 4, what the gnawing locust have left, the swarming locust has eaten. What the swarming locust has left, the creeping locust has eaten. And what the creeping locust have left, the stripping locust have eaten.
Okay.
In verse 25, then I will make up to you for the years that the swarming locust has eaten, the creeping locust, the stripping locust, and the gnawing locust, my great army, which I sent among you.
Okay. So how many times does the word locust appear in those two verses?
10.
10. That's exactly right, 10. The word locust occurs more times in the book of Joel than any other book in the Bible. Okay, so that's just counting. We can do that for whatever that means. So we just kind of talked about what shocking event is just taking place. So are the locusts, and you kind of answered this question, but Mike, let's talk about it more. Are the locusts the literal insects, or are they symbolic of something else? And what did you say? You kind of went down a road of bringing both those things together. So pick back up on that if you would.
Yeah, the locusts are in the long run, the locusts are actually the armies, both the Assyrians and the Babylonians.
Mm-hmm.
But as it relates to both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom,
Yes.
and Judah, which we've been prophesied to. So, but it also, there were many instances of the traditional insect locusts or the snakes or many plagues that also came into Israel over a period of time. So this could very well be, and I believe it was, an actual event, and then it was symbolic of yet something to come, the invasion from the north, really, to come in a period of time.
I would agree. I think that you have here an event where the locusts come in and devour the land. And you do have, like you mentioned, the plagues going back to the time of Moses. Okay, and this is not just, I mean, this is a pretty, standard thing of every now and so often you'd have these locusts come in. So if we take that as a fact that a group of locusts do come in and bring devastation into the land, is God using that event then to teach Judah and Israel, because he's probably prophesying primarily to Judah, primarily the southern kingdom, but yet if we dated it to late 800s, early 700s, it's definitely before the fall of Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom. So is it then a natural event that is taking place, but also in that event, and when I say natural event, it could be supernatural in the sense that God brings a judgment but uses the locust. But is he using this event as a real invasion of locusts on the land, but also as a harbinger of the attack of Assyria on the northern kingdom and Babylon on the southern kingdom?
Yes, that's what I believe. That's the way I read it. It was a real event. It was an invasion of locusts as it was given, just like in Moses, just like in the 10 plagues that came on Egypt, the same way. So it appears that it would have been that, and it gave him reference then to, or the what you would almost say a type or like a harbinger yet of the things to come. To begin with, and then there was a lot of the other prophets that keyed in mostly on Judah, but like Ezekiel, who gave the idea of just like your sister in the north is coming to you too. So it's both sides. I mean, both events, both invasions to this locust army, and this describes a lot of the locust armies too as coming in, and each in its column. In other words, it would come in a particular way, and it would spread out and cover everything, and there was nothing that could escape it. And so this was the prophecy of both of those invasions from the north, from the Assyrians and the Babylonians.
Yeah, and if you think of it, you have the swarming locust, the creeping locust, the gnawing locust, and what was the fourth one? There's four. Stripping locust. Yeah, if you kind of look at that, how would that, and let's say, even though it supplies both to Israel into Judah, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Israel. Okay, just think of this in if Joel's primary prophecy is the southern kingdom, how would the destruction of Jerusalem by Babylon, how would it remind you of that? Because when one locust left, the next locust would take. Think of it. Okay, 605, they come in, and they kind of take the best of the land. Daniel goes out, with that. But they kind of leave it functioning, okay? In 597, with the second, and all these attacks intensified because Jerusalem would kind of rebel against Babylon over these periods of time. So when they come back the second time, the attack on Jerusalem is more severe. And the third time in 586, they just wipe out everything. They destroy the temple, they break up the sea, all the different articles, they carry off everything, okay? Does that kind of remind you of what one locust comes and takes, what's left the next locust gets, and what's left the next locust gets? So that's actually, would you think, Mike, a pretty good picture of what does happen to Babylon?
Yeah, of course it is. It's a military strategy that's used even in our military. The experience that I've had, when we go into the attack, and I was involved in some of this, the Marines would go in first, and it was their job as a tip of the spear to go in and break the back of who was there. In other words, take out the elite. You would take out everything that was pertinent. It would be communications. It would all your high-level targets would be hit first. Then you had, after the Marine tip of the spear went through, then the Army, which was huge, it was a lot bigger than the Marines, and he would go in and just cover the land at that point. And we would move through the land. It would move all the way through beyond what we wanted to occupy, and then come back. And then we would just move left and right like just tearing up everything in there in occupying as much as we could. And that was, it was not an initial thing. It never happened up front. It was a first blow, and then from there it went on to, and what's what we see with these locusts. We see an initial shock coming in, then we see a more devastating shock, and then finally a spread that goes through and destroying everything else behind it.
And, Shay, if you remember, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were they smart kids or dumb kids?
Very smart.
Yeah, they were the best.
Mm-hmm.
And so if that is typical of what they're taking out with the first, you mentioned the first assault, he's taking out the potential leadership. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar is, and takes them back. So yeah, that's kind of a lot of, as you pointed out there, Mike, a lot of similarities between what the locusts do, and so what these invading empires, especially Babylon, will do to Judah. And so I think it's, if you look at all that, it is, I think, a proper conclusion that this is talking about locusts, the insects, but it's also pointing to this, using this as an illustration of what will happen to the land in a more significant way. And there's some other examples of this, that you'll find in the Bible too. So anyway, okay. But I want to move on. The theme of the book of Joel really is the concept of the day of the Lord. The concept of the day of the Lord occurs a number of times in the Bible. So let's read this fourth question, Shay, if you would, and let's talk about this.
The phrase, the day of the Lord, occurs 5 times in the book of Joel. How many times does it occur in the entire Bible? How many times in the Old Testament, and how many times in the New Testament?
So in the book of Joel, the phrase, the day of the Lord, occurs 5 times. Now, I recently read somebody else and count this up, so I have a little bit of an advantage. But would you guess how many times the phrase, the day of the Lord? Now, it occurs in the book of Joel more than any other book in the Bible. Okay. So don't try to extrapolate, 5 times 60, because you're going to get a way exaggerated number. But how many times do you think that maybe that passage, the phrase, the day of the Lord, occurs in the Bible? It's not a massive number.
12.
that's not bad. It occurs actually 21 times.
Oh, okay.
17 in the Old Testament, 4 in the New Testament. And so, read the fifth question, because let's jump right into that.
What do you think the day of the Lord means?
Okay, Mike, what is your, I know you probably have some thoughts on that. What do you think the day of the Lord means?
That is the actual day that the Lord is executing something, whatever that might be. And that
Yes.
happens several times. And the two primary ones are the first event and the second event of his coming. So those are the two primaries. But it is not, I don't think it stops there. It is a lot of days that he is executing. Potentially could have been the day of the Exodus out of Egypt. It could have been a day of the Lord as he moved out.
Right.
So there's other things involved in that.
So let's just kind of generally think about if you heard the phrase, the day of the Lord, and you had never had any familiarity with that at all, Shay, what would you maybe just kind of guess? What does it mean by the day of the Lord?
I mean, I take it to mean in God's timing. Whatever his timing is, whatever he dictates it to be, it's his timing on his turn in his day.
Okay, could we think about this? And he does dictate his timing. An event occurs which is obviously an event of God, where he obviously has done something. The day of the Lord, when it's unmistakable that what has transpired has been by God, not by natural events, not by the causation of man, but it is overwhelmingly clear that it is the activity of God that is taking place. Mike, would you think that would be one way to kind of describe the day of the Lord?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is the Passover.
Yes.
As coming out of Egypt, the firstborn all died in Egypt is just something that had to be a day of the Lord, his execution at that point.
Yep. Yep.
I think about fire raining down.
Yeah. Sodom and Gomorrah. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Now, so the day, and I think Mike, you brought this up, that it can not only be, kind of like when we think of the day of the Lord, and you mentioned the first coming and the second coming of Christ, the Lord. Okay. Now, usually when the day of the Lord is talked about in general, somebody will talk about the day of the Lord in terms of an eschatological event, that the day of the Lord has something to do with the end of time, or even tonight in prayer meeting, okay, Matthew 24, the questions that they asked Jesus as they come back from the Temple Mount. They look at the stones, look at the buildings, all this stuff, and three questions. It's interesting that the first question Jesus never asked, when will these things take place? When will the stones? Jesus never asked the answer to that question. And the reason I think he never answered it, because it became very obvious that because 30-something years later, the Romans in 70 AD destroyed. He never really spends much time answering that question in Matthew 24. Maybe a little more time in Luke 19. But really in Matthew 24, he doesn't spend any time. But he spends a lot of time answering the second of the two questions. Okay, when will these things be? When will the temple be torn down, the stones be torn down? Okay, he doesn't really answer that. But the second two questions, he spends a lot of time answering. And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? And so when we think of the day of the Lord, is there always kind of a component of that has to do with the
Judgment or wrath.
Yes, the return of Jesus and the end of the age, and of course that has a big part of it. So let's jump into the sixth question. We're going to look at some passages in particular, and we'll talk about this a little while.
Okay. In Joel chapter 1, verse 15, chapter 2, verse 1, and 2, verse 11, what inferences can be drawn about the day of the Lord from these passages?
So, Mike, and these are not just right next to each other. They're spread out a little bit. So, Mike, will you read one? Let's do these one time. Let's talk about 1:15, 2:1, and 2:11, and we'll talk about these a little bit one at a time.
Okay, then 1:15. Alas for the day of the Lord is near, and it will come as destruction from the Almighty.
Okay, so he's saying. So he's writing this again, late 800s, early 700s, probably. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about date because people will argue over that because the setting of the book doesn't make it very exactly clear. But what is he talking about? Because he's talking about a devastating event coming. What might he be talking about there, do you think, Mike?
I believe he's still talking about the Assyrians coming into the northern kingdom with that statement.
Yeah, I would agree. Or at the latest, maybe including Babylon and the southern kingdom. Maybe, but yes, okay. I don't think that's an eschatological statement, end time event statement right there. Okay. Any thoughts on that, Shay?
No, sir, because I don't know how you would know any different.
Well, you really can't. But I will say this: in prophecy, sometimes a statement is made by the Lord or by a prophet that can apply to a lot of different situations, and sometimes we'll hang in there. So we'll read 2:1. Let's talk about this one a little bit.
All right, 2:1. Blow a trumpet in Zion and sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. Surely it is near.
Now, does that one sound a little bit different than the last one? What do you think about that, Mike?
This one, my first reading on it, my looking at it, this is more in the eschatological realm of looking downrange. This comes
Yeah.
almost at the millennial reign.
Yeah, I would agree.
In this.
Yeah, I think it is. Now, you could be talking about, you're not talking about Assyria here. You could be talking about Babylon coming into Jerusalem, actually. But I think this is eschatological. I think this is like the millennium. This is our the tribulation / moving into the millennium type deal. Okay. How about you, Shay?
Just reading that verse by itself, I wouldn't necessarily say that, but reading what comes after it, because it specifically says nothing's happened like this before and will again. So it's not to me like a physical invasion or an attack of an army, because that's happened a lot before and will happen a lot after this time that it was written.
And you made a good point. We're trying to cover a lot of ground in about 30 minutes, but on study, you never just take one verse out of context, and we're kind of doing that a little bit here with this concept, the day of the Lord. But you never, when you just read the, I think it's true. People say I read a couple verses before, a couple verses after. I really think that if you really want to get context and be careful about it, maybe the couple verses before, a couple verses after, but if you read the whole chapter it's in, the chapter in front of it, and the chapter after it, which is when you're trying to get the context of something, if you read those 3 chapters, the chapter it's in, the chapter before, the chapter after it. But so I think as you read this, that really adds to that. Okay, read verse 2:11 if you would, Mike.
Okay, 2:11. The Lord utters his voice before his army. Surely his camp is very great, for strong is he who carries out his word. The day of the Lord is indeed great and very awesome, and who can endure it?
Yeah. What do you think that sounds like?
That's millennial as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah,
the day of the
it's-
Lord there and who is great, that is a judgment
Yeah.
statement, and it goes a lot farther.
That is, and it may, what I'm seeing there almost also not only millennium, but the events leading right up to the millennium, like Revelation 19, the return of the Lord. I mean, that sounds like, boom, yeah. That so some of these passages, I think that, back when you go back to chapter 1, verse 15, that's probably talking about Assyria and or maybe Babylon. These last 2, I think, have more eschatological implications. And we say, I don't want to just throw out around a big word, but eschaton means kind of the end, okay? And so eschatology is the study of the last things, like they asked Jesus in the Mount of Olives, what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? The Bible teaches that this age will come to an end. That's taught again and again in the Bible. So, okay, go to the 7th question, if you would, Shay.
Yes, sir. Read Joel chapter 2, verses 30 through 32. Does this remind you of any New Testament passages? If so, which ones?
Okay, as Mike reads these 3 verses, let's listen carefully and think about New Testament passages this may apply to, okay?
All right, beginning in verse 30. I will display wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes.
Okay, stop there for a moment. What New Testament passage or passages does that remind you of?
I think the very beginning first reminds me of the crucifixion,
Yeah.
where there was change in the middle of the day. And then further on down with the blood and the fire and the smoke reminds me of in the end when like the sea is blood and you can't drink any of it, everything in the
Yeah.
earth is destroyed.
It particularly reminds me of Revelation chapter 6, especially the second part of it. But also, this is, yeah, it reminds of crucifixion, but also this passage in Joel 2 appears almost directly in Acts chapter 2, talking about the day of the Lord. And so, it's got a lot of New Testament implications there. Let's move on. Read. I didn't mean to break you off, but I don't want to. There's almost a couple of these here. Okay, go ahead.
All right, in 32. And it will come about that whosoever calls on the name of the Lord will be delivered. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be those who escape. As the Lord has said, even among the survivors whom the Lord calls.
Okay, the first part of that 232 reminds us of a passage. For whosoever shall call upon the name of the Lord will be saved. That's Romans. That's right out of Romans. And so, yeah, that does right. So, you see these passages right here that are quoted in Acts and in Romans, pretty much verbatim, part of it, and then the implication, like we said, of others. So, Joel is a fascinating, because turn over to Acts chapter 2, Mike, and on Peter's great Pentecostal sermon, he seems to, not seems to, he does draw directly from the book of Joel. So if you look at chapter 2 and go down and read verse 20 of chapter 2.
The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and glorious day of the Lord shall come.
Okay. You see that? And so, Joel is a very eschatological book. I mean, before the day of the Lord comes, these things will take place. So it's kind of interesting there. Now, this is let's look at the eighth question. This is an interesting question, okay?
Okay. Read Joel chapter 3, verse 10, and Isaiah chapter 2, verse 4. What seems very interesting about these two passages?
Okay, would you read Joel 3:10 and Isaiah 2:4? I know you could probably quote Isaiah 2:4, but you've been teaching this. So, but
Right.
read these two passages if you would, Joel.
All right, Joel 3:10.
Mike, yes.
Beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears, and let the weak say, I am a mighty man. And 2:4. And he will judge between the nations and will render decisions for many peoples, and they will hammer their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift up sword against nation, and never again will they learn war.
Okay, the Isaiah passage speaks of beating what into what?
Weapons into guarding, doing away with the weapons.
Yeah, beating your weapons into farming implements. Okay. So what does Joel say?
Opposite of that.
Yeah, the opposite. Beat your farming implements into weapons of war. So how do these two passages kind of go together? Or what are they referring to? It's very interesting that I can remember one of the very first times first time I read it and paid attention to these passages in Joel. I said, oh yeah, this is just like Isaiah. I said, whoa, it's the reverse of Isaiah. Okay, so what is it talking about here?
You go back to verse 9 in Joel 3. Proclaim this among the nations. Prepare a war. Rouse the mighty men. Let all the soldiers draw near and let them come up. Beat your plowshares into swords. This is standing up. This is getting ready for a war.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So if we look at these, could Joel be talking about the day of the Lord in terms of tribulation that precedes the millennium? And that what Isaiah talks about, obviously, is the millennium itself. In other words, that before Jesus comes on the throne, he has to defeat the enemies that are there at his coming. And so how would we take this?
I would look into at Armageddon whenever the nations, it says, proclaim this among the nations.
Yep.
And this is where God will draw, or Jesus will draw all the nations into the valley of Jezreel or the valley of Jehovah, whatever valley
Yeah,
they've got the
Jezreel,
different,
Jehoshaphat, yes,
different
yes.
names for it. But that's when he brings them in. So he's preparing them all. Come with your warfare,
Right.
and then he's going to enter into judgment. After that, they will need no weapons anymore. And so they will turn them back into farm equipment, and they will go do what they need to do.
Great thought. Okay. Need to add to that, Shay?
That's exactly what I was thinking.
There you go. Yeah, you good.
Couldn't have
Oh.
said it better.
Now, it's interesting that one of the things that years ago when I was went by the United Nations building in New York City, and I knew the statue was there, but there's a statue of a guy there, and he starts out with kind of looks like he's holding a sword, but it kind of morphs into a plow, kind of plow ox type plow, not So, any rate, has the United Nations brought peace? No, I don't want to get political in 5 minutes we got left here tonight. But at any rate, it has nothing. But Jesus is the Prince of Peace, and as you often refer to him, like the government will be on his shoulder. And we will not have proper government until he comes and rules and reigns. Our time's about up, but let's do this ninth question, if you would read that, Shay, and then passage if Mike would read.
Yes, sir. Finally, let's read Joel chapter 3, verses 11 through 15. What is this talking about exactly?
All right, beginning in verse 11. Hasten and come, all you surrounding nations, and gather yourselves there. Bring down, O Lord, your mighty ones. Let the nations be aroused and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat. For there I will sit to judge all the surrounding nations. Put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. Come tread, for the winepress is full, the vats overflow, for their wickedness is great. Multitudes in the valley of decision, for the day of the Lord is near in the valley of decision. The sun and the moon grow dark, and the stars lose their brightness.
Okay. So what do you think all this is talking about?
Again, I think that's Armageddon at
Yep.
that point.
Yep. And when he says, for the day of the Lord is near, what aspect of the day of the Lord is he talking about here?
Judgment.
Yes. The final eschatological. Now, if you want to think of the events at the end of the millennium in Revelation 21 through 10, we could think of that as eschatological. But this has to do, I would think, like you said, the tribulation and literally the events that lead right up to the millennial reign of Christ, which would be the Battle of Armageddon. And
So my thought there too is Matthew 25 in the goats and the
goats and
sheep.
Mhm.
So that judgment at that time. So that's nation judgment.
Yes.
So not individual
Yes.
judgments.
Very good. And the nations are called here, and the nations are judged. Now in Matthew 25, he separates them from one another. It's interesting that will there be nations in the millennial reign of Christ?
Yes. They talk about the nations bringing
Their-
their wares and
Yeah,
bringing
wares,
goods
mhm.
and all of that to them. And and there will be nations that do not want to honor him as well. And there's judgment coming to that as
Yeah,
well.
and he talks about it. They don't go up to worship at the times of the great feast tabernacles and different ones that will take place actually during the millennial reign of Christ. And so, yeah, it's so. Joel is a deeply, it's kind of really a unique book, and we're closing this up now. But it's a deeply, deeply eschatological book. I mean, this whole concept of the day of the Lord is, and look how long ago you're talking. This is a pretty early minor prophet. I mean, he's writing before any of the major prophets. He's writing before Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. I mean, this is really. I mean, you're not that far removed from honestly the time of Solomon and the United Monarchy, 903, if this is the middle, 50, 60 years maybe, and the dating again, we talk about that, but
I do have a question about that.
what's that?
What determines a major prophet and a minor prophet? Because this seems pretty major to me.
Well, a lot of times it's just the length. The one that throws the monkey wrench into that is Daniel being considered a minor prophet, a major prophet, because Daniel is only 12 chapters. So other than Daniel, you could say Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel is just length because they're 3 of the 6 or 7 longest books in the Bible. But with Daniel, so I think it's length, number one. But number two, it does seem pretty major. But I think the reason Daniel is classified, now remember this is,
People classifications,
yeah,
right?
our classification.
Yeah.
That
Okay.
Daniel is just such a deep eschatological and apocalyptic book, kind of like Revelation. And apocalyptic, slightly different than prophetic, but Daniel's definitely prophetic, but it's also apocalyptic, kind of looking forward. This is there are apocalyptic elements here, but yeah, I mean this is pretty significant right here. Zechariah, for example, the one that I would make an argument that could have been classified as a major prophet would not have been really. There's a lot here. Don't get me wrong. But Zechariah would have definitely said, if you're going to, you want to reclassify that, you could definitely call that a major prophet. It's 14 chapters. Hosea is 14 chapters, but it's kind of a, very limited, scope type book and stuff. So, anyway, but I don't have the answer for that question.
I was just wondering.
Just give some ideas. Well, any thoughts before we go, Mike?
No, it's a good book.
Yep.
It's a good all of the minor prophet books are just recommend reading all of those and try to keep them in some sort of context.
Yeah, and take several readings. But that's what I kind of do this little study. Encourage you to read the Bible because, and I mean, how many Christians even know? Could tell us anything about the book of Joel and stuff and everything. So, hey, God bless everybody. Y'all have a great evening.